few minutes. So this morning I did post my ambition to get through the rest of ventilation, and then looking at internal and external respiration should be pretty quick. So I believe that's the last part of the essay 4. Oh no, essay 5. That will almost finish up essay 5, other than ventilation perfusion. And then we will move into something you should remember from blood, which is a lot of the features of hemoglobin. So that is a pretty straightforward essay. I don't think you should struggle with it unless you really don't understand how to read a graph. And so if we meet all those ambitions, then we should only have the last essay for Tuesday. If we exceed my ambitions, then we will have gotten into at least the first part of the last essay, which is on the carrying of carbon dioxide by the blood. And just leave for us the negative feedback and regulation, all the inputs that regulate respiratory rate and depth. So to do those ambitions, I have skipped, Bird must find this very exciting. I have skipped the group that was called C last time, and they're talking about patterns of respiration, hypoventilation, and dyspnea and stridor. And no worries, we will address those in the lab, because today we're going to be doing spirometry in the lab. And that's when we'll really focus on the volumes that people went through last time and the dead space effects that hypoventilation has, or that affect dead space has on when you're hypoventilating. So let's move on to the people who were in group D. We now still don't have the full class here, but let me put chat up too, just in case there's somebody that needs to be reviewed. Is there anyone that was in group D? So the questions that concern Dalton's law and Henry's law. And I apologize for once again apparently not loading it from my Canvas studio into Canvas Conversation. So it's possible that this group struggled with those questions and now know more about it. So maybe instead of having them speak, maybe I'll redo this and just have you put into chat whether you were in group D or E last time and you want to return to that group. And we'll just start into doing the breakout rooms. I think we still don't have the full class here, but if you were in the group that was about Dalton's and Henry's law, or the internal external respiration and regulation of oxygen, gas movement through the bronchium bronchioli, then that's group E. Then please just let me know. Okay, I see at least one person giving me some input. And I will put whoever's there back into those groups. Okay, so let's start up I don't want to lose more time, so let's start the breakout rooms, and you still can put into the chat. So what I will do is set them up and rename them, and while I'm doing that, you can put into chat if you were in those groups. Okay. So we want to do 5 groups. Okay. Oops, and I had you said, sorry. Let me get rid of that and do a different one because it automatically put people in. Recreate, there we go. Sign manually. Recreate, okay, let me rename them. This will be group E. and 8. And this will be name. Let me make sure that I'm doing this the same. This puts in. Did I leave that open? I did, yes. I just want to make sure I'm doing this the same. Yeah, I am, okay. 3. Okay, let me give you sign manually. No, I don't want to recreate, sorry. That's what, all right. I'm going to keep changing this. All right, change this to 15. Let's just do 15 minutes. Okay. All right, so I'm going to open, oops, I didn't assign people because I need to put those people that want to be in. Let me assign them. Get back to chat here. Okay, so for D, we want Manpreet, Stephanie, Stacy, and Sophia. Okay, let me just put a few other people into D. Okay, how many people I got here? 26, okay. 5 people per room, that's all right. One more person, maybe. Okay. And then assign this one. In group E, we have June, and we have Stacy. Let's give a few more people. This. Okay, and then assign the rest of you guys. I can just assign 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Perfect. Okay. So I'm just going to put a few more people into this group, which has 2 questions. And assign to this group. And assign to this group. And I think there's only 3 in this group. That's fine. What happened? 5, 5, and 5. All right. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms. back. So does Group D have a spokesperson?
Yeah, I'm the spokesperson for that.
All right, thank you, Manri. So can you tell us about Dalton's law and effect it has on altitude has on it?
Yeah, so Dalton's law states that since gases in the conducting zone are a mix of old and new air, partial pressure of gases are less in the atmosphere. So thus the altitude increasing.
Hold on a second. So we can get to the old and new air mixture, but just talk about it in terms of the atmosphere. So like if you're at sea level versus at high altitude, then we'll go to the other stuff. So.
Okay. Let me pull up my notes for that.
Okay.
So the atmospheric pressure, that will be 760 mercury. And when altitude increases, the whole pressure, which is the atmospheric pressure, will decrease. So the mix of gases, which is nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water, those will be in proportion and have partial pressure. So for nitrogen, it will be approximately 600 mercury and will make up about 79% of the whole atmospheric pressure. And oxygen will be approximately 71% and will be about 160 mercury. And carbon dioxide will be less than 1%, and water varies, but it is low usually anywhere.
Okay, so and that doesn't matter as to where you are in the altitude, right? It's all the same percentage.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is something that, you know, hopefully now that you've listened to the lecture, you understand, but a lot of people kind of casually say if you go up in altitude, there's less oxygen. And there is exactly the same amount. So up here it's 79%, 21%, and less than 1%. We can worry about water vapor when we talk about the air going into your lungs. So it doesn't matter whether you're at altitude or sea level. The percentages remain the same. And I know that the essay doesn't directly ask, or the short answer to the lecture question doesn't answer it, but even if you go diving, you are breathing condensed air. So if we went even lower and you were diving, you're breathing pressurized air. So it's kind of just same constitution, but forced into a tank. It's still the same percentages. So what is varying, as Manreet said, was the total pressure, right? So here it's 760. Here it's going to be less than 760. And here it's going to be greater than 760. Now, when you're diving, it's greater than 760, both because the air is pressurized in the tank, so you're breathing this, think of it as condensed air forced into the tank, but also you have the pressure of the water above you that is adding to atmospheric pressure, as it were, and so you're getting a greater. So what happens now, Manreet, how do you calculate partial pressures from these?
What do you mean by like how to?
So if I knew, let's say at 760, that's where you started to go through the numbers. So at 760 millimeters of mercury, what's the partial pressure? How would you calculate the partial pressure of?
So you would multiply 79% by 760, and that will give you approximately 600.
Yes, okay. All right, so that is millimeters of mercury. So out of that whole pressure, the vast majority of it, 79%, and therefore the vast majority of that pressure is due to nitrogen gas. So going back to last week when we talked about blankets, you could think of these as different weight blankets on top of you. And down at sea level, nitrogen is 79, so it's a heavy blanket. Oxygen is a medium blanket, and CO2 is maybe your sheet. And when you go up to high altitude, that ratio is still the same. The heaviest blanket is nitrogen, but you have many fewer of these blankets on top of you, so your total is less. So when you get up to altitude, we won't worry about the numbers, but there is a nice table in the textbook and in the lecture slides showing you how that would be affected. So, if we were to do some altitude, which is, I can't remember, 10,000 feet or something, then you drop this considerably. And therefore, these guys are all going to go down as well, right? Mm-hmm. So now when you're diving, what's going to happen? Anyone, Manreed or anyone else? It's going to be the same. What's going to happen to these partial pressures? Are they going to go up or down, increase or decrease?
The pressure is going to go way up.
Yeah. So that means all of the partial pressures, this will cause all partial pressures to go up. Partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of nitrogen, and partial pressure of CO2 will all go up when you're diving. Now, why do you care about this? So now, before we get to the old and new air, Manreed, let's see how the question is worded. It just asks you to do those things. And then the next question, 8, brings up the alveolar gases. So what happens now when you go to breathe in? So let's talk about the old and new air. So fresh air, say out here, and we're at sea level, so we'll just worry about sea level. What were the numbers for, just say, nitrogen, oxygen, and CO2? You started to give them to me, so why don't you give them to me again, Henry?
I believe it's at the 600 mercury, and then oxygen is approximately 160 mercury.
Okay, millimeters of mercury, and this one is really low, right?
Yeah.
So what, 0 point? Did you have this one on your list?
Oh, no, I didn't.
I think it's 0.04 or something. I don't have it right off the top of my head either. Okay, so that's what you actually have out here in the world. But when you go to breathe in, remember we talked last time about there being a lot of air in your conducting zone. The majority of it's not in your bronchi and stuff. We use these numbers, I think, last time, although having done the lecture again, maybe I can't remember if we did, so stop me if you hadn't heard this. But the vast majority of that, yeah, we did. The residual volume is in the alveoli gases. So as you're breathing in, those gases are in there already, and they were left by your breathing out last time. So your lungs are extracting oxygen from those gases, and they're depositing CO2 in those gases. Plus, you're humidifying the air a lot, and we won't worry about the number-wise with water, but you're adding water, and all of those things are lowering the partial pressures because you're mixing them all together. So hopefully this is making sense. So then in the alveoli, you have different partial pressures, right? So did you start giving them to me, Manreed, or approximately?
Yeah. So in the gases in the alveoli, for nitrogen, it will be 569. So that basically doesn't really change. For the oxygen, it will decrease and it'll be 104. For carbon dioxide, it'll increase and become 40. And then it will also increase for water, but we're not really talking about that.
Right. Now you notice that in fact, maybe I'll use another color. These numbers you got to know. And this number, and again, not exact, but those numbers, I think some places it says 159 for the 160. It doesn't matter if you're somewhere in there. In this ballpark, I can't remember if it's 0.4 or 0.04. Again, it's less than considerably less than 1. So what had happened is when you mix that old air with the new air, you increased the CO2 amount quite a bit, and you decreased the O2. Now, because it's partial pressure, it's like a recipe, you're adding things together. Nitrogen had to change because CO2 took up more space, as it were. But you don't typically have any exchange across the membrane of nitrogen. And that's going to be because of our next law, which is Henry's law. So Dalton's law of partial pressures, you should know both in the physical sense of it being, meaning that the total pressure of 760 is a summation of all of the individual pressures of the individual gases, including water vapor in the atmosphere. When you go and breathe it in, that rule still stays the same, but you're mixing this old air and this new air together, like Manreed said. So who is going to be doing Henry's law?
It's still me.
That's still you. Great. Thank you, Manreed.
Okay, so for Henry laws, it basically states how easy it is to get a gas to dissolve, because before entering blood, the gases must dissolve in the fluid of the alveoli. And this has to do with the gas's solubility level, which is constant for each specific gas. And each gas is a mix of gases. Each mix in a mix of gases dissolves according in proportion to its partial pressure. For example, the steepness of the P gradient. So thus, exchange is affected by the relative solubility of gas. For carbon dioxide, it is the most soluble, then comes oxygen, and then nitrogen is the least soluble. Temperature also affects this, but it is generally constant, so it doesn't change much. And then to answer the question, less oxygen will enter the alveolar fluids in high altitude because the solubility of oxygen is not that high. Thus, it takes more partial pressure to get oxygen to dissolve into the fluid. However, for carbon dioxide, it is much more soluble and thus does not need that much partial pressure to get dissolved in the fluid. So it will not be affected by the drop. It will not be that much affected by the drop in partial pressure, as the atmospheric pressure will also decrease when altitude increases. So carbon dioxide will still be exchanged in similar amounts at high altitude.
Great, that's perfect. Okay, so she brought up some critical points. So remember the numbers that I am showing you to the left and the right, those are the gases. And Henry is, how do you get those gases to dissolve? Because remember, one of the rules of getting the gas across the lipid bilayer of the type 1 cells and then ultimately into the blood is you have to dissolve that gas first. And I really would like to stress what she said about solubility is a constant. So you know, you can relate to this. It's not solubility. I think the problem people have is they get the idea of dissolving versus solubility confused. So you know this if you've ever tried to, say, put sugar in water or salt in water, which are highly soluble substances, versus trying to dissolve something that's not very soluble. Maybe people don't use it very much anymore, maybe starch or corn flour. You know, you're trying to get this stuff to dissolve that's not very soluble. So that's a constant feature of that particular substance. And the only way you can sometimes encourage it to dissolve more is to increase the temperature. So because we are more or less keeping a constant temperature in our alveolar gases, I mean, clearly if you're in a very, very cold situation, the air might be slightly colder, but you've done all this work with your conducting zone to try and make the air be brought up to close, not core body temperature, but close to that. We're going to kind of ignore temperature and call it a constant So we don't have to worry about, maybe I'll just say stays constant. It's not a constant itself due to warming of the air. So we're not going to worry about it as a variable, but just like Manreet brought up, the relative solubility, the solubility is a constant, but how much dissolves depends on its partial pressure. So you could think of partial pressure as like a force to force these gases to dissolve. If they're not very soluble, you need a lot more force, a lot more partial pressure, or the oxygen or the nitrogen won't go into solution. CO2 is highly soluble, so takes very little partial pressure gradient to get that very little partial pressure push to get it to dissolve into the water of the alveolar fluids that are lining the alveoli. Once that gas is dissolved, it can readily move on its gradient to get into the blood. So what we're going to be looking at soon is those gradients, and that's the internal and external respiration numbers. So these numbers 104 and 40 are going to reappear when we talk about internal and external respiration. So that's great. So we've got 3 laws. Remember, I said to help you remember them, they're in alphabetical order, ironically enough. We have Boyle's law, which had to do with how volume and pressure changes in the thoracic cavity help you ventilate. And then Dalton's law, where we looked at how any mixture of the gases is a sum of each of the individual partial pressures and how that can vary depending on the total pressure of the gas that you're talking about. And then Henry's law. So Henry's law says, okay, well, you've got these various partial pressures that are encouraging the gas to go into solution, but it depends on how soluble what is the solubility constant for that particular gas. So, so before we go into group E, let's just briefly do diving versus high altitude, because this is part of the essay. So if you're at high altitude, and we're just going to look at, for high altitude, we're going to look at O2. Its partial pressure decreased, right? We don't have to worry about a number. Instead of being 21% of 760, maybe it's 21% of 600. And so it's going to be less, right? I know this is early in the morning for math. You decrease the partial pressure. That means what's going to happen to the amount that you can dissolve, more or less. Anybody can just shout it out. Increase or decrease?
Less.
Less. So you're going to decrease the amount dissolved. If you looked at the percentage up in high altitude, it would still be 79%, but it's 79% of less total pressure. So that means the partial pressure went down, and that means less is dissolved. So there truly isn't less oxygen up at high altitude. There's less force to get that oxygen to dissolve, so that less oxygen ends up in your blood. Okay, so what about CO2? It's also going to have a decrease in partial pressure, but is it and less would, remember you're trying to get CO2 to leave, right? So you're not worrying about dissolving it in the fluid. So can it just as easily leave, or even maybe easier for it to leave?
Professor?
Yeah?
I have a question. Why did you put 79%?
Because oops, I'm sorry, I did, you're right. Sorry, 21%. I was going back to those numbers, 21%. Thank you, Noah. So it's still going to be, less than 1%, whatever it is, of less pressure. So that means it's going to be even less in your alveolar gases, and your body is still producing quite a lot of CO2. So it's going to actually find it easier to leave. Plus, you're not dissolving it. You're not worrying about trying to dissolve it, right? You're exiting. Are we okay with this? It's already a dissolved gas. Any questions about that? So this leaves easily. Even more easily than at sea level. Blood to alveolar gases. We okay? Questions? Let me get chat going again, since right now I don't have, where's my chat? It's over here now. Okay. All right, I don't see anything. Okay, so now let's go diving. So we already agreed that now it's still 21% oxygen, but you increased the total pressure. So is it easier or harder to get it to go in solution? That's going to increase your partial pressure. Easier or harder to get it to go into solution? Anyone?
Easier.
Easier. So that means you're going to increase the amount dissolved. Now, for divers, this isn't a good thing. It sounds like it would be, because you'd have a lot more oxygen in your blood. But high oxygen levels cause a sort of drunken feeling in divers. So it affects the brain. So it's almost like an intoxication. And it impairs judgment. So this is especially true if you're diving at depth, not shallow dives, but when you're really going deep and you have not just the compressed air increasing your partial pressure, but also the weight of all the water above you increasing the partial pressure. So it's being forced into increasing the total pressure, so the partial pressure goes up. So that's not a good thing. Are we okay? And one of the reasons why people dive in pairs, because if one person starts to, lose their judgment, the other one maybe isn't as affected at that point. So CO2 is also going to go up, but again, we're trying to get CO2 to exit. So it may be a bit harder for CO2, but it's very, very soluble. So it can still pretty much easily exit. But we now have to worry about a new gas, because we didn't have to worry about this at high altitude or sea level, because nitrogen is so insoluble that virtually no nitrogen moves. It won't dissolve. Even though it's a high partial pressure, when you at a high altitude, it's even a lower partial pressure. At sea level, it doesn't dissolve. In either case, it won't dissolve. But once you're diving, now you have nitrogen will dissolve. And you get nitrogen in your blood. So you've increased that. It's still 79% of nitrogen, but now you increase its partial pressure enough that it does dissolve. Now, that's not an issue. Nitrogen is a really inert gas. It itself isn't a problem. The problem arises when you go from depth rapidly upwards and the total pressure suddenly changes. So if you're diving at depth and your total pressure that's pushing the nitrogen in is high, but you swim rapidly up, then that gas will come out of solution. Just like if you screw the top off sparkling water, what's above the water is CO2 at high pressure, not at sea level, but it's pressurized. They've pushed a lot more CO2 above the air that's in the bottle above the fluid. And you know what happens when you unscrew it? Suddenly bubbles appear in this, what looks like a bottle that has very few, if any, bubbles in it. Suddenly a whole lot of bubbles appear, and that can happen in your blood. And this leads to rapid ascension, leads to the bends. Okay. So, so this is, I believe, let me look at the essays. Yeah. This is the middle part of essay 5, where it asks to explain how gases move in normal conditions. So you have to dissolve them, who's the most soluble, what kind of effect does partial pressure have, and then when you go to high altitude and when diving. So I think the book in the text deals with the high altitude part pretty well. And if I remember right, there's like a bit of an insert about diving. So I understand, I think they call this oxygen narcosis that occurs when you have elevated oxygen in your blood affecting your brain and your judgment. And then the bends is when you have bubbles appear. And those bubbles, as you might imagine, can be really serious because it can impair blood flow. It's not that it's a physical barrier that blood may flow through capillary beds and block that. So what they do for people like that is if they start having the bends, they put them in what's called a hyperbaric chamber. They push up the total pressure within that chamber to redissolve the oxygen and then gradually decrease the pressure in the chamber. And what the person's doing is allowing nitrogen to come out of solution and to breathe it back out into the atmosphere.
Professor, I have a question.
Sure, Noah.
So, let's say you stay at high altitude. Would your equilibrium stay at the lower, level of pressure, partial pressure for O2 at that point, since equilibrium is 104, and if you're at higher altitude, it lowers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, in a way, yes, but what actually your compensation happens more at the level of your blood cells, and we are going to talk about that. For one, when we did this in the blood chapter, remember what happens is you end up with an increased level of EPO released because your tissues are kind of chronically hypoxia when you first go to altitude. And so your oxygen carrying capacity of the blood goes up and you get more efficient at carrying that oxygen. And we're also going to talk about BPG today, and that also changes if you go and acclimatize to high altitude. So I don't think you can't really have control out of these variables since partial pressure is dependent on your altitude and total pressure. Solubility is dependent on its ability to cross. Those are all fixed. There's nothing you can do about that to acclimatize. But you do change your blood, so it can be better and more efficient at carrying the oxygen. Does that answer what you had?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It just goes hand in hand, basically.
Right. Okay, any other questions before, or any other pieces of information? I actually had the numbers in my notes. I should have put them down for altitude, but that's okay. Just get the concept they're changing. Okay. That's somebody else's telephone, so can you mute yourself? Okay, thank you. All right, so let's go on to group E. And group E is dealing with the fact that those alveolar gases are diminished for oxygen compared to what's out here. And then, therefore, your ability to get that oxygen from the gas into solution and then into the blood depends kind of on the configuration, which we've already somewhat discussed for 9 of the alveoli. But let's go back and talk about that. So who's the spokesperson for Group E?
That'll be me, Stacy.
Okay, Stacy.
So for number 9, the respiratory membrane allows for efficient gas exchange because of its large surface area, the steepness of the gas gradients, and the subtype of tissue it is composed of, which is simple squamous epithelia.
Sorry, I did that again. Great. And the simple squamous is exceedingly thin. So we're used to it when we, a squamous cell in the skin. And, you know, those got pretty darn skinny when they were up in the living layers. But these are even thinner. So when you go to draw the lungs, you know, the best you can see really is the nuclei that bump up sometimes. But sometimes in the sectioning of the lung, when you go to look at that slide, you know, it's the whole bunch of empty air pockets. So you can imagine if you tried to cut a knife through a sponge, which has a lot of air pockets, or maybe a moist bread, some of those pockets kind of get crumpled down, and you may see that, so they won't look as flat. So you have to, I think they use some analogies. It's as thin as a tissue paper or something like that in the book. So she said a lot of surface area. And what was the third thing you mentioned, Stacy?
The steepness of the gas gradients.
Yes, so that means you want a steep gas gradient. And the gradient we're really worrying about is O2 to get it to dissolve. And again, soon we'll learn these numbers. We just said that in the lungs, alveolar gases, it's a partial pressure of 104 millimeters of mercury. CO2 doesn't need as steep a gradient because it's so much more soluble. But O2, it does need a steeper gradient. So when you go up to altitude, that gradient gets less steep. It's harder to dissolve the oxygen. Once you do dissolve it, you're not going to get to as high a level because you didn't have as much partial pressure to push it in, even though it's still 21% out in the air. So you'll end up with less oxygen being loaded into the blood. Okay, great. Thank you, Stacy. Some other factors to think about, because we do focus on pathologies, is that not only is the cell very thin, but there's also a thin layer of a fluid. You need that fluid to dissolve. But if for some reason that increases, then what's going to happen to your ability not to dissolve the oxygen, but to rapidly move it through the fluid into the cell and into the blood? What's the consequence of that on oxygen to the blood? Is it going to increase or decrease? Anyone? So you have to walk from your chair that you're in now to your front door versus you have to walk from your chair to, a quarter mile down the road. It's going to take a lot longer, right? So this is going to decrease. Moving to the blood, the rate is going to decrease. So what sort of analogy are we talking about? Well, pneumonia. So pneumonia is really just a whole bunch of fluid in your alveolar pockets. The fluid has gotten not only often thinner, but it's gotten deeper, but it's also sometimes has, pathogens growing in it. It might be thicker. So it's more difficult for that oxygen, even once you've dissolved it, to move rapidly to the blood. And pneumonia could even be where you fill it totally with fluid, so no air could be in there at all. It also means that since it's so easy for CO2 to go and move through out of solution and into solution, you may even have it enriched higher than normal for CO2. And so people with pneumonia have this extra fluid in their lungs, and it makes it hard to move gases into their oxygen into the blood. And it's still, CO2 just can move pretty easily, so it can be even higher in CO2 in those alveolar gases. Okay, so Stacy, are you going to be doing 10 and 11 as well?
Yes.
Okay.
So for number 10, the partial pressure of oxygen controls perfusion by changing the arterial diameter. So when the alveolar ventilation is inadequate, the local partial pressures of oxygen are low because blood takes oxygen away faster than ventilation can replenish it. This leads to terminal arterioles constricting, so it redirects the blood to respiratory areas where partial pressure of oxygen is high and oxygen pickup is more efficient.
Okay, great. One of the things I'd like to stress about this, well, first of all, in the question, it's not clear. I didn't put it in the question because I broke it up kind of into two parts. But this is the part of the essay called ventilation perfusion coupling. And one of the things I think I stressed in the lecture, and I was alluded to by Stacy, but not said directly, is these are local areas. So that person with the pneumonia, maybe they don't have pneumonia in the whole lung. Usually you don't, because you remember the bronchioli, once they branch down, they don't share air across other branches. Remember the colors in the model showing air once it gets to a certain point, moving it through the conducting zone, it's not shared with the air in other areas of the lungs. So if a local area has this condition, what you want to do is try and constrict blood flow to that area and send that blood as it comes in. You want to be sending blood more readily to areas where efficiency happens. So for example, this would be, if those alveoli if these guys have fluid in them, have an increased amount of fluid, like in pneumonia. So what's going to happen is you'll want to be more efficient to load the oxygen, like she said, and you want to constrict blood flow into that area as long as it has lower than normal P partial pressure of oxygen in that alveolar gases. Okay, so what happens then for 11 to the bronchioli?
So partial pressures of carbon dioxide control the ventilation by changing bronchiolar diameter. So when alveolar carbon dioxide levels are high, the bronchioles dilate, and this allows carbon dioxide to be eliminated from the body more quickly. And the bronchioles are in areas of low partial pressure of carbon dioxide will constrict.
Great, perfect. So again, you're going back to efficiency. If you have some piece of your lung, and maybe it's not pneumonia, maybe it's bronchitis, and some of the mucus is making it harder to ventilate through that area, so that you tend to see less oxygen going to those alveoli, and you're not getting rid of CO2 very easily. Well, let's be more efficient with how we load our blood, so we'll vasoconstrict that area. But that would mean we have less surface area of our lung that is really participating, because we're vasoconstricting, we're not sending blood to that part. So let's see if we can fix that by causing those bronchioli to respond to the high CO2 by dilating. And therefore, if you dilate, ventilation may increase to those alveoli, and therefore you'll fix that problem. You'll bring in more oxygen. You'll allow those blood vessels then to subsequently dilate. And the bronchioli, as long as they're stuffed up or whatever, will stay dilated because, they won't necessarily stay dilated, but it'll fix that problem. That's the idea. So this is ventilation perfusion coupling. And the diagrams in the book explain it pretty well, I think. But if there are any questions about that, then, because we're moving on to a new topic after this, well, sort of. we're shifting topics and essays. This is the end of essay 5. Any questions on that? Okay. All right, so let's move on to Group A, and they are dealing with the internal and external respiration. And I thought instead of sharing this, where I write messily, I would share with you, while we're doing this, the picture in the, you get to share screen. So when they do these numbers, you can see the numbers in the lecture slides. Okay, so who is the spokesperson for Group A?
That would be me.
Okay, Noah.
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, the diagram is sort of self-explanatory. So you have inspired air, which is going to be P160, and you're going to have carbon dioxide also, and it's going to be P.3. It's going to mix with the old and new air in the lungs, and that's why you come out with P102, 104, and 40 PCO2. And you said we could keep the number in the pulmonary veins to 104, but there's a loss because the lungs will actually take some of that because it's still functioning tissue and it needs that stuff. But as it goes down to the tissues, it's going to be at 104 mmHg, and carbon dioxide, it's going to rise up or come out the same at the lungs, 40 mmHg, and then it's going to go to the tissues, and then gas exchange occurs at the tissue, and it's going to change to pressure of O2 is going to be at 40 mmHg, and partial pressure of CO2 is going to be 45. And it's pretty much just going to go back to external respiration and repeat the cycle again.
Okay, so don't get confused because this is external, as he mentioned. This is why it's external, is you're going between the outside world's gas that's in the alveoli and your blood. And the arrows I drew are the gradients. You're using 100 millimeters of mercury, and what the blood is still carrying is about 40 millimeters of mercury. So you have a gradient of about 60 here that you, at sea level again, that you're pushing into the, to dissolve the gas and then have it move through the cells and into the blood. CO2 is arriving just slightly higher than what's in the alveolar gases, 45 versus 40, but not to worry. It's so soluble, it doesn't need much of a gradient. Well, it's also just moving from an already dissolved state to out to the gaseous state here, and it's ease of doing that is doesn't take much partial pressure gradient. So that's external. So I'm going to put check marks and numbers that you need to know. So both of these guys and this one, and just realize I got it off by a little bit, I guess here. PCO2 is going up, about 100 fold here from the atmospheric level to the alveolar gas level. And so that's external. You've got it in the blood. Now, one of the things that I wanted you to realize is that this is going to equilibrium almost always. So whatever is in the alveolar gas ends up in the blood. And that's where this 104 versus 100, I don't care which number you use. If you want to use the 100, that's fine. If it's easier for you to say, okay, what's in the gases in the lung, 104 goes to equilibrium with the blood, then you could use the 104. So that's why I wrote or 104. I don't care which of those two numbers you wish to use. So now you go in, the blood transports this, and we're going to talk today about how the gases are transported. But once it gets to the tissues, on average, it's going to see the same numbers on average. So the same numbers here and here. Are we okay with this? So now gas has to move, the CO2 has to move out and the O2 has to move in. And we're going to see 100 arrive or 104 and a 40 millimeter of mercury inside the tissues. So this is internal, right? Is this what you are also supposed to do, Noah? Am I doing this for you? Or did you want to do this?
Wait, what? What happened?
Are you going to be doing internal as well? Didn't you just do external? Or did you, I miss it in my trying to write?
No, I did mention that how the tissue perfusion happens, and that's internal, and then you're going to go back.
Okay, so now the oxygen goes in and the CO2 goes out along its, again, fairly shallow gradient, fairly steep gradient. Remember, this is all dissolved, so these gases aren't needing to worry about their solubility constant, but they still have a gradient, so they can move along those gradients. And when I said this is on average, it's because if the tissue was exercising, say this is a muscle you're exercising, then the PO2 would drop even lower and the PCO2 would go up even higher, making it even easier to transfer oxygen, right, on its gradient. So let's say you change this number to 20, if I can write very well with this stupid pencil, 20 for O2, and you made it 50 for CO2. That would make the gradient even steeper, so the 100 would go even more rapidly in, and this CO2 would go more rapidly out. Now, of course, that exercising muscles blood mixes eventually in the vena cava with all the other blood from tissues that are not doing anything more than basal metabolism. So they're all mixed together. So on average, this is the amount you're seeing. Now, there's a nice focus figure in the book showing, exercising versus resting tissues and these numbers. The numbers I want you to know are these on average numbers, and I want you to be able to use them when you do the part of essay 5, I think, that asks about internal and external respiration. So make sure you do know the numbers. So I'm going to just go ahead and put check marks by all the other numbers you should know. So both of those and these guys. Now it seems like a lot of numbers, but they're all pretty much the same because we're going to go to equilibrium. So you're just having to remember where you are in the body. Okay, good. All right. So.
You still want me to talk about conditions?
Yeah. Let's see.
You pretty much covered a lot of it with the altitude, high altitude and diving. That's mainly what I was going to go into.
Oh, okay. So for 12, so if you want to recap it quickly, we can recap that.
Yeah, so basically at higher altitude, you're going to have a different amount of partial pressure because at different altitudes you have different total amount of pressure. And because of that, you're going to have different gradients, which affect how fast, as you were saying in internal respiration, how fast and how slow, or how easy it is for gas to exchange. So at high altitude, the carbon dioxide gradient is going to be steeper, so it's easier to expel. And at higher altitude, oxygen is going to have a less steep gradient, so it's not going to flow as fast. And then when you're diving, you have compressed air. As you said earlier, it's going to be harder to expel carbon dioxide, whereas it's going to be easier for oxygen to flow just because of the gradient differences.
Okay. Hopefully that will help. You could apply these to the numbers without putting numbers on them, but once you go to high altitude, as he said, this drops. And since you're going to equilibrium, if this is now only 90, this can only be 90. So that means that if this tissue is still at 40, there's a less of a steep gradient, and you're not going to reach 100. You're going to only even at equilibrium reach 90. So your tissues are going to have less oxygen. CO2 is less affected because of its high solubility. And even though there's less CO2 in the air, you don't need much to get it out of your lungs, and therefore that's one reason why a lot of climbers carry oxygen with them. They actually don't carry compressed air. They carry, pure oxygen compressed, because you're not so worried about getting rid of your CO2 as you are at making sure you get enough oxygen to your tissues. And then diving, I didn't do, but you're going to reverse those trends as Noah mentioned. Okay, are you also doing 13 about why low levels of hemoglobin would dramatically change oxygen levels in the tissue, even if ventilation is functioning normally? And this has to do with the amount of CO2 in oxygen. That's the amount of oxygen that's carried by dissolved gas versus on the hemoglobin, right? Is that what you guys discussed?
That would be me.
Okay.
And we basically discussed this in really simple terms. And we said that hemoglobin is our body's the primary way of transporting oxygen, and carries 98.5% of our oxygen. So simply put, like, if the hemoglobin levels are low, then we lose this primary way of transporting oxygen. The only other way oxygen travels is via plasma, but that's only 1.5%. So if hemoglobin's low, that 1.5% isn't enough to cover any of our needs.
I think I forgot the 5 on there. Okay, some more numbers to know. So once we've dissolved the gases into the alveolar fluid, they move down those gradients, 104 into 40. But once it gets into the blood, those dissolved gases, these are dissolved in the plasma, then rapidly move into the red blood cells, so that 98.5, which I started to write, but I didn't finish writing, percent is actually bound to hemoglobin. And later we'll talk about the CO2. We'll come back to it. So this is oxygen. But a much higher percentage of CO2 is carried as a dissolved gas. So I think that's somebody else's number 19 question, but it's more like 7 to 10% is carried as dissolved gas. However, some, and we'll come back to this later, is bound to hemoglobin, and we'll come back to that discussion later, but the vast majority here is going to be bicarbonate. Okay. So this is actually what's on the right here is the last essay question. We'll come back to that more. And this is more dealing with what's happening in essay 6. Okay, so how about group B? Do you have a spokesperson to list the factors that affect the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin? This is a review from what we did in the blood.
Hi, I'll be the one doing number 14.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the 5 factors that affect O2 affinity for hemoglobin. Number 1, we have the number of oxygens that are attached to the hemoglobin. So the more oxygen that is bound to the hemoglobin, the more the affinity for the oxygen increases. And then another factor is temperature. So as temperature, okay, so I wrote it backwards, but as temperature increases, the affinity for oxygen of the hemoglobin decreases.
Okay.
Let's see. Another factor is the amount of hydrogen ions. So the more hydrogen ions there are, the less the affinity is for oxygen to be bound. This is also true for the partial pressure of CO2. So when the partial pressure of CO2 is increased, the affinity for the oxygen is lower. And then the last factor is BPG. So the more that is present, the decreasing of the affinity happens.
Oops, sorry. Okay, great. That's fine. I mean, it doesn't really matter which of the vice versas that you look at. The one thing I'm going to add to this, because she did a great job, but just one thing is that these two are linked. So you'll notice that in the graphing, when they start graphing the hemoglobin affinity curves, that they kind of do that as a common graph. And when we get to SA7, you'll see how that's linked. So if once we've talked about that linkage through both the equation involving carbonic anhydrase and also just naturally, when you dissolve CO2 in water, it tends to combine with water and make H pluses. And that's one reason why people enjoy carbonated beverages, because they are a little bit, some of them are very low in pH, and it tends to have that little bite that, well, some people like it, that makes you feel like your thirst is being quenched better. So we will come back to how those are linked. But it has to do with the chemistry of what happens when you combine CO2 and water. So BPG, I think we're going to talk about later in the next group as well. We'll review what that stuff is, but that you did a great job. And there's one other I would like to add to this, and we'll talk very briefly about it, and that is the type of hemoglobin. Because you have both fetal versus adult. How are we doing on time here? That's a versus. I didn't put my, okay. Well, we're kind of, hopefully we'll get through B. So let's move on. And there's different states of hemoglobin. And there are different terms for it. Was that still you? I forget who was talking here because I didn't have you highlighted. Was that you, Probri?
18 is going to be me.
And who's me? So okay.
So for oxyhemoglobin, that's going to be all four oxygens are bound to it, the hemoglobin. And then for deoxyhemoglobin, that's less than 4 oxygens bound, and there's always at least one H plus bound to it. And carbamino hemoglobin is carrying carbon dioxide and 1 to 3 oxygens, but it rarely carries only one oxygen. That's only under extreme conditions.
Okay, so there's no pure hemoglobin. They're all either in one state or another. They're either oxy, deoxy, or carboamino. So in the figures that we're going to be dealing with for SA7, deoxyhemoglobin is also represented as this, because as we'll soon hear, it has an H plus bound to it. And so does the carboamino hemoglobin. So this has H plus and bound to it as well. So the only time you have something that's symbolized as hemoglobin like that in these figures, it's oxyhemoglobin, has 4 bound to it. Okay, thank you. So that business about the H plus brings up our first effect, Bohr effect, and that's the lecture question 16. Are you doing that as well?
Yes. So
Okay.
the Bohr effect occurs when hemoglobin loses some of its affinity for oxygen when an H plus binds to it, and when the O2 unbinds from the oxyhemoglobin, that gives you deoxyhemoglobin. And in the tissues, the hemoglobin is carrying 4 oxygens, but as it gets to the tissues and H plus ions go up and carbon dioxide starts coming out of cells, that H plus will jump onto the oxyhemoglobin, and that tends to boot off the O2, and it'll become a carbonamino hemoglobin. And then in the lungs, the opposite occurs, and usually the first thing that comes off is the carbon dioxide, but it usually comes off at the same time as the H plus.
Okay, we'll talk about in essay 7 why they come off. And so when they come off, what happens to the affinity of hemoglobin? What happens to the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen? Does it increase or decrease in the lungs? So we saw that when H plus binds, the affinity decreased. So what would happen when H plus comes off? It would increase the affinity, right? Are we all right with this? So these guys are mirroring each other. This is the lungs. The thing that's in blue is the tissues. And it's really brilliant when you think about it, because of course, where do these H plus comes from? Well, partly they come from where you make acidic waste products when you're doing metabolism. And metabolism uses up oxygen. So that means you'll make your gradient to move the oxygen stronger, to remove it from hemoglobin, but also you'll be releasing H pluses, and you'll be releasing CO2. And the CO2 leads to more H pluses, and therefore you'll be able to unload the oxygen. When you go up to the lungs, you're going to be removing CO2, which, as we'll soon see in essay 7, also will decrease H pluses. That will strip the hemoglobin of the H plus. Its affinity to oxygen will go up, and oxygen will be more easily bound to the hemoglobin. So that is the Bohr effect. And let's see what time it is. We just have a minute. But let's see if we can do the Haldane effect in that minute, because we want to keep these guys straight as well, right? So is there anybody in group C willing to define the Haldane effect?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay.
The Haldane effect is the displacement of CO2 when blood is oxygenated in the lungs. CO2 can only bind to deoxyhemoglobin as the oxyhemoglobin arrives in the tissues and gives up its oxygen. It first binds hydrogen, the Bohr effect, which then allows the hemoglobin to bind to the CO2. Or more accurately, it binds to the globin rather than the heme or the hemoglobin. The CO2 is carried bound to the hemoglobin or in gaseous form in the blood to the lungs, where hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen displaces the CO2 in favor of binding to the available oxygen molecules. And then I've got PCO2 is inseparably linked to a decreased pH. And then, of course, it's not just carried in the blood by hemoglobin or CO2 or as gas, but we'll get to that later.
Okay, great. So these two, Bohr and Haldane, I have no idea why the book deals with them so far apart. They talk about Bohr effect in one area. You have to go far, far away in the book to find the Haldane effect. But they are married to each other because one affects the other. So with CO2 coming off in the lungs, that will also also remove, indirectly, will also remove the H plus. And so the Haldane effect is the actual describing of how easy it is to get CO2 to bind to the globins on hemoglobin. And they're only able to bind if you do not have 4 oxygens on the hemoglobin. The shape of the hemoglobin molecule prevents the binding. So the one thing we didn't do on SA6 at this point is actually look at the curves, which I did keep open. And BPG is question 18, where we did talk about BPG as a product of altered glycolysis pathway in red blood cells. And we could talk about it a little bit more at the beginning of next time. But we're going to be plunging next time into, we got pretty much through what my ambition was today, the last essay. And it's going to have to do with transporting CO2. So I'll post those probably, it looks like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's only 7 questions left. So I'll probably go ahead and post those, and maybe rather than break you into groups of giant groups, we'll just kind of go through them. So come prepared, because this will also be our review on Tuesday. So you should be working on essay 7 as much as you can on your own and trying to write that up. Okay, and we'll do review and these last few topics. I will say the last essay can, especially the second part of it, can be quite challenging. So you do want to come prepared, and don't wait for me to go through this, or wait for your classmates to go through this with you. All right, so I'm going to meet you in lab in about 15 minutes or at 1 o'clock if you're coming at that time. And I'm going to start it by talking in general of, well, those couple questions that we missed, which would be breathing patterns and how they can affect ventilation. Now that you've heard quite a bit about how you move the gases into your lungs, and some abnormal conditions like restrictive and obstructive diseases, dyspnea and stridor. So we'll meet in lab and we'll start that. Don't forget to bring your handout. You're going to be looking at a bunch of videos and getting data to fill that handout out. Okay, I will stop sharing this messy thing and see you about 15 minutes, if that's good. Any issues or questions? Let me just check